Students exploded into laughter the moment Mr. Collins, the smug AP calculus teacher, extended a piece of chalk toward Mabel Carter, the black elderly janitor. Mabel, always quiet, always kind, had spent years earning those calluses on her hands, pushing mops, not pencils. But when Mr. Collins threw out a sarcastic dare, asking her to solve the hardest calculus equation on the board, no one expected her to do anything except step away. What unfolded next left the room in stunned silence, jaws slack with disbelief. Mabel didn't just answer the challenge. She rewrote the rules and revealed a brilliance long buried under uniforms and assumptions. The third period bell rang, and with it came a strange heaviness in the room. Mr. Collins's advanced placement calculus students usually knew what to expect. A lecture, quiet scribbles, maybe a quiz. But today was different. Mabel Carter had entered like she always did, mop in hand, sneakers worn smooth by years of unnoticed work. She moved across the polished tile, the usual invisible part of the school day, until Mr. Collins spotted her. He loved moments like these. His wit was legendary, his sarcasm constant. Scanning the class for attention, his gaze landed on Mabel. "Class," he said, his voice practically humming with mockery. "We've been stuck on this one for a while. Maybe Mabel here can help." He pointed to the board where the toughest equation of the term sat unsolved. The class erupted again. No one had cracked it. Surely the janitor wasn't going to. Mabel paused, her mop still in hand. She didn't get the joke, not at first. Mr. Collins smiled wider. "Go ahead, Mabel. You've seen enough formulas around here, haven't you? Show us how it's done." The challenge hung in the air like a dare dipped in cruelty. More laughter followed, some students whispering, some snickering openly. They expected her to shrink, to walk away, maybe nod politely and slip out the door. But Mabel Carter had stopped running from moments like this long ago. She stood quietly for a breath as the laughter bounced off the walls. She'd heard this tone before, the kind that dismissed her age, her job, her entire identity. What they didn't know was that Mabel once stood in classrooms very much like this one, but not as a janitor, as a star. A gifted mind on the path to brilliance before life changed her direction. Floors replaced formulas. Silence replaced ambition. But not today. Today, she walked toward the board. Setting her mop aside, she moved with grace, each step quiet but unshaken. A hush swept over the room. No one knew what to expect. She reached for the chalk. The soft squeak echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Eyes locked on her as she scanned the equation. The numbers, the symbols, they weren't strangers to her. Her gaze sharpened, her breath steady, and for the first time that morning, the class wasn't laughing. They were waiting. Some students tried to keep laughing, but others were too curious to look away. Mr. Collins leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, that familiar smug look fixed on his face. He was certain she'd stumble, and he was counting on it. But Mabel Carter had no intention of failing. As her hand glided across the chalkboard, the snickers began to die out, replaced by a focused, uneasy quiet. Mabel's calculations were sharp, her gestures clean and confident. What had started as a joke was transforming into something no one had expected. Eyes narrowed, smirks faded. The students who had once giggled now sat bolt upright, their laughter replaced with silence. Expressions twisted from amusement to stunned awe, and Mr. Collins, his smirk began to twitch, then dissolve entirely, replaced by a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a while: shock. Mabel wasn't just solving the equation, she was dominating it. She stepped back slowly, once finished, her body still as the chalk settled. The equation, once an intimidating, unsolvable beast, now sat calmly resolved on the board. Not a number out of place, not a step unclear. The entire room froze, not even daring to breathe. The same woman they'd overlooked, the black elderly janitor, had just done what none of them could. Mabel Carter had solved the impossible. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred, thick with realization, with respect, with shame. The air pulsed with disbelief. No one blinked. No one dared move. Even time seemed to hesitate. Mabel stood quietly, the chalkboard glowing behind her under fluorescent lights, her breath calm, her posture unshaken. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply existed, like a truth that could no longer be denied. Mr. Collins still leaned against his desk, but something had changed. The authority he'd worn so effortlessly had cracked. His face, once curled in mockery, was now unreadable. a battle between pride and a dawning understanding. The silence broke, not with applause, but with a single whisper from the back of the room. Did she really just solve that? Heads turned. All eyes returned to Mabel. Whispers rippled across the classroom. Soft, stunned reactions from students still reeling. One by one, those who had mocked her now stared, mouths parted in disbelief. Their faces held something new. Not pity, not confusion, awe. Mabel remained motionless, not seeking validation, not needing it. She simply let the moment exist. Her presence, like the solution she'd left on the board, demanded nothing, but earned everything. And as the fluorescent light flickered softly above her, as breath returned to the lungs around the room, one voice spoke again in a whisper. She's a genius. Still, Mabel said nothing. She didn't need to. She wasn't looking for applause or any kind of recognition. This wasn't about proving someone wrong or flaunting hidden brilliance. It was about reclaiming something she hadn't felt in a long time. Control. It was about dignity, about power. Something quietly stripped from her across the years, piece by piece. Mabel Carter had been underestimated more times than she could count. Her entire life, people made assumptions about her age, her job, her gentle presence. They never saw the woman behind the uniform. To most, she was invisible. Background. Someone to pass in the halls without a glance. But Mabel had long ago learned the truth. Those who worked behind the scenes were often the ones with the deepest stories. They saw her as the black elderly janitor, a helper, someone who wiped away others' messes. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined, was that Mabel Carter once stood at the edge of greatness, a rising star, a mathematical prodigy on the path to becoming one of the best. She had a mind that could slice through problems like a blade through silk. But life doesn't always care about brilliance. Responsibilities mounted. Family needed her. Money ran short. And the dream, so sharp and real once, began to fade. A job as a janitor had kept the roof above her head and the lights burning, but it was never who she truly was. Until today. Today, in this quiet classroom, she'd unearthed something she'd buried deep. A brilliance dulled by years of mopping floors and being overlooked. She'd reminded everyone of what she still carried within her. And most of all, she'd reminded herself. The bell rang, loud and sudden, breaking the silence. But no one moved. The classroom stayed still, wrapped in the gravity of what had just happened. Mabel quietly picked up her mop and turned toward the door. But before she could leave, Mr. Collins spoke. "Mabel," he said, his voice thinner now. No sarcasm, no smugness, just a raw mix of humility and something almost like regret. I didn't know." She turned to him slowly, her expression calm, composed. Her eyes didn't need to speak anger. She didn't need to scold or shame. She had already spoken with her actions. Mabel gave a small nod, and the hint of a smile. One not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Then she stepped through the door. As it closed behind her, the room began to breathe again. A few students stirred in their seats. Some blinked, others still frozen in the same posture from minutes ago, trying to replay what they just witnessed. One student leaned toward another and whispered, "Did you know she was that smart?" The second shook their head. "I never thought she was capable of that. I'm kind of embarrassed." And so the story of Mabel Carter began to ripple beyond that day. Word spread. Students who had once passed her without a second look began to glance up when she entered a room. Some smiled. Some nodded. She was no longer just the janitor. They began to see that beneath the uniform there lived a story, a hidden past, and a mind that once dreamed of formulas, not floors. A woman whose life had taken a different path, but who still carried brilliance in her bones. And as for Mabel, she simply continued her work as she always had, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Deep down, she knew it. Everyone who had witnessed that moment did. They had finally seen her, not as a janitor, not as background, but as someone worthy, someone powerful, someone real. Mabel Carter was no longer invisible. The days that followed at Jefferson High carried a different energy. Mabel, the black elderly janitor, had become something of a quiet legend. Students who once passed her without a glance now gave her subtle nods in the hallway. Some whispered to each other as she walked by, their faces thoughtful, even reverent. Something had clicked inside them. It wasn't just that she'd solved a problem they couldn't. It was how she had done it. Calm, unshaken, dignified. She had revealed what many of them hadn't even known they needed to see, the power of quiet confidence. And Mr. Collins, the very man who had mocked her in front of the class, wasn't immune to that shift. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. For years, he'd believed he knew who belonged where. To him, Mabel had always been just part of the scenery. She swept the halls, emptied trash bins, kept the school looking clean. But now he knew he had misjudged her more deeply than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, a week after the moment that changed everything, Mr. Collins found himself outside the janitor's closet. He wasn't even sure why he'd come. Maybe guilt. Maybe something more honest. A need to acknowledge truth. He knocked gently. "Mabel?" he said, his voice unusually tentative. She looked up from the bucket she was scrubbing, her expression unreadable, as always. She had spent years keeping herself guarded, blending in. But when she saw Mr. Collins standing there, her hands stilled. She didn't know what to expect. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. Mabel gave a slight nod, placing the mop gently aside and drying her hands on her uniform. Something was different in the air between them. She could feel it before a word was spoken. "Of course, Mr. Collins," she said, her voice even, steady, but not without warmth. She was no longer the woman who had quietly entered that classroom days ago. Something in her had reawakened. He stepped into the small room, pausing awkwardly as he looked around at the shelves of cleaning supplies, the strong scent of bleach clinging to the air. He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who I was dealing with." Mabel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She didn't need the apology. She had made peace with it the moment she put chalk to that board. But this was something else. This was Mr. Collins coming to terms with how wrong he had been. "You didn't know," she said quietly. "Most people don't. But that doesn't mean I didn't have the ability all along. It just means I stopped showing it." He nodded slowly, her words settling deep. "I've been teaching here for years," he admitted, "and I always thought I was the smartest person in the room. But you taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn. Sometimes the brightest minds aren't the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones working behind the scenes, unnoticed." Mabel's gaze softened, just a little. "We all have our paths, Mr. Collins. Mine led me here. But that doesn't mean I don't still have something to give." There was a pause. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. For the first time, she saw in his eyes not just respect, but recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of her value, not just as a black elderly janitor, but as a person who had spent years hiding something extraordinary. He cleared his throat again. He straightened up, his voice firmer now. "I want to make it right. I'll be putting in a good word for you. You deserve more than just this job." Mabel was caught off guard, though she didn't show it. She had never lived her life looking for praise. She hadn't needed recognition to know her worth. But something about Mr. Collins's words felt meaningful. Not grand or performative, just honest. A small, quiet win. She gave him a faint smile, her expression humble but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Collins. But I don't need more. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Honestly, this is all I need." He stood there a moment longer, searching for something to say, but there was nothing left. The lesson had been learned. Mabel Carter was far more than just the black elderly janitor. She had become a force, and he would never forget the way she had taught him that, with nothing but silence and chalk. As he stepped out into the hallway, Mabel returned to her routine. The mop slid into her hand like it had 100 times before. Outside, Jefferson High thrummed with the everyday chaos of students rushing to class. But something had changed. The world hadn't shifted, but the way people saw her had. Mabel walked those halls with quiet confidence, her presence no longer invisible. She had reminded everyone that you can't judge someone by their title or their uniform. She had reclaimed her space, not just in the school, but in their minds. And slowly, everything began to shift. Weeks passed. Jefferson High began to transform. Mabel Carter, once just a quiet figure in the background, now carried a respect that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just the students. Teachers began to look at her differently too. Where once there had been dismissive nods, now there were glances of admiration. But it wasn't just her intellect they were responding to. It was the way she carried herself, like someone with nothing left to prove, like someone who had already won. One morning, while Mabel was sweeping the cafeteria floor, Principal Davis walked by. Usually a man of few words, he stopped this time. "Mabel," he said, his voice slower than usual. "I need to talk to you." She paused, leaning her broom gently against the wall, and looked up. "What's on your mind, Mr. Davis?" He hesitated. It was clear he had rehearsed something in his mind, but was still unsure how to say it. "I've been hearing about what happened in Mr. Collins's class. The students are talking. They're calling you a genius. And honestly, I think they're right." Mabel felt something stir, something subtle, but powerful. A flicker of pride. That word, genius, had never been said aloud about her. Not like this. Not with weight behind it. Still, she kept her composure. "I don't need to be a genius, Mr. Davis," she replied, voice calm. "I'm just doing my job." He looked at her a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I've heard about your past, that you were once headed toward a career in mathematics. I didn't know that about you. I didn't know any of it." She gave him a quiet smile. "Most people don't. Life has its way of leading us down different roads." Principal Davis looked like he was still processing, still trying to catch up to everything she was. "Well," he said finally, "I've been thinking about how we do things here, about how we treat people, about how we treat our staff. You've shown me I've been looking at everything the wrong way," Principal Davis said, clearing his throat. "You reminded me that everyone has value, no matter their position or background." Mabel didn't reply. She wasn't there for praise. Recognition had never been her goal. She had come to terms long ago with her place in the world. But still, she couldn't help but feel a quiet, private satisfaction. Things were shifting. People were starting to see her, really see her, for the first time. "I want to offer you something," Principal Davis continued, his voice steady now. "We've got an opening in the math department, part-time. It's not a lot, but it's something. A way back into the work you love. You could help students, tutor after school, maybe even teach a few advanced sessions. What do you think?" For a moment, Mabel couldn't speak. Her heart fluttered, and she felt a lump form in her throat. The idea, the possibility, of being back in a classroom, in front of a blackboard, guiding students through complex problems. It lit something inside her, a spark she hadn't felt in years. But then she took a breath. She steadied herself. He nodded, clearly struck by her clarity. "I understand," he said slowly. "But just know, Mabel, you're always welcome. If you ever change your mind, you already proved you have something incredible to offer." She nodded once more, genuine but gentle. "Thank you, Mr. Davis, but I'm exactly where I need to be." As he walked away, Mabel picked up her broom again. But something inside her had shifted. She'd been offered the chance to return to a life she once dreamed of, and she'd chosen something else. Not out of fear, out of peace. The school still saw her as the black elderly janitor, but Mabel knew who she really was. She wasn't defined by a job or an old title. She was defined by her mind, her strength, and the unshakable dignity she'd carried all along. And if anyone remembered her, it wouldn't be because of what she cleaned. It would be because of who she was. The stories about Mabel began to spread, whispers in the halls, conversations behind lockers, but she didn't pay them much attention anymore. She had already proved what she needed to prove, and now, she walked through Jefferson High with a kind of quiet grace that no one could ignore. Months passed, and Mabel Carter had become something far beyond a whispered name. She became a symbol of unseen brilliance, of strength in silence, of the hidden power in people the world often forgets. She had never asked for acknowledgement, and yet, it had found her. The students who once giggled now looked at her with awe. The teachers who once dismissed her now nodded with respect. Because the truth was undeniable. Brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in degrees or titles. Sometimes, it walks the halls with a mop in hand. One afternoon, as Mabel made her way through the corridor, she overheard two students chatting ahead of her. They hadn't noticed she was just a few steps behind. "Have you heard about Mrs. Carter?" one whispered, eyes wide with excitement. "She solved this insane calculus problem like it was nothing. They say she was a mathematician before she came here." "No way," the other said, clearly amazed. "A janitor who's, like, a genius?" "Yeah," the first replied. "I heard she's tutoring now. Some of the top students even. I bet she could have been a professor if she wanted. It's crazy." Behind them, Mabel smiled quietly to herself, and kept walking. The students weren't wrong. She could have easily been a professor, a scholar, someone whose name was attached to journals and lectures. But life had taken her down a different road, and somehow, she had found peace in that. The job she did may not have fit the world's definition of success, but it had given her stability, purpose, and a kind of quiet satisfaction. Still, as she walked past those students talking in hushed awe, Mabel couldn't help but wonder if they truly saw her. They spoke about her intelligence as though it were the only thing that defined her. But that wasn't the lesson she had learned. The most important truth she carried wasn't about equations or aptitude. It was about finding stillness in your place, even when others overlook it. That night, her phone rang. It was Principal Davis. "Mabel," he said, the tone in his voice heavy. "I wanted to discuss something with you." She sat up a bit, the sudden seriousness in his voice stirring a little concern. "Is everything all right?" "There's a district-wide program starting," he explained. "They're gathering real stories, examples of perseverance, of unexpected success, people who've taken unconventional paths and found something meaningful. And I gave them your name." Mabel blinked, stunned for a moment. She had never once asked to be seen, let alone be highlighted. She wasn't the type to stand under a spotlight, but somewhere deep inside she knew. This was something more than recognition. This was about truth. "I'm honored, Mr. Davis," she said cautiously, "but I'm not sure I'm the kind of person they're looking for." "You are, Mabel. Whether you realize it or not," he replied with conviction. "You've already changed lives in this building. It's time others see that too." His words stayed with her long after the call ended. She thought of the students, those moments when she'd caught them looking at her differently, with something like belief in their eyes. Maybe sharing her journey wasn't about her at all. "All right," she finally said the next morning, voice firm but calm. "I'll do it, for the ones who still don't know they're allowed to choose their own way." The day of the event arrived quickly. The auditorium was full. She stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, curious, attentive, silent. "I'm not here to impress you," Mabel began, her voice low but assured. "I'm not a genius. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who followed a different road and found peace there." She took a breath, her hands resting softly against the sides of the lectern. "Success isn't always about where you end up. Sometimes it's about how you carry yourself along the way. Even if it's not the life you imagined, it can still be the life that fits." She paused again. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was weight. People were listening. "I've learned that your worth isn't in titles or applause," she said. "It's in the courage to be yourself, even when no one notices." When she finished, the room didn't erupt. It held stillness, deep, thoughtful stillness. And in that quiet, Mabel knew her message had landed exactly where it needed to. She stepped down from the stage with no fanfare, no flashing lights, but inside, there was something real and steady. Acceptance, resolve, and a peace that no one could take away. From that day on, Jefferson High didn't just respect Mabel Carter. They remembered her.